The world knew Ace Frehley as the space ace of Kiss, the silver-faced guitar hero who set his instrument ablaze on arena stages throughout the 70s. But what almost no one knew was that his connection to rock and roll royalty stretched back further than anyone imagined, to a humid afternoon in 1969 when an 18-year-old kid from the Bronx named Paul Daniel Frehley walked into a Greenwich Village recording studio and stumbled into a moment that would haunt him for nearly 4 decades. September 1969. The summer of Woodstock had just faded into autumn, and New York City's underground music scene pulsed with an electric energy that felt almost supernatural. Jimi Hendrix was at the absolute peak of his creative powers, spending nearly every night in recording studios across Manhattan, chasing sounds that existed only in his mind. Electric Lady Studios wouldn't open for another year, so Hendrix bounced between smaller facilities, often showing up unannounced with a guitar case and a head full of ideas that would never make it onto official albums. One of those studios was a cramped second-floor space on Bleecker Street, a place where the carpet smelled like cigarette smoke and spilled beer, where the mixing console had more duct tape than original parts, but where the acoustics somehow captured something raw and real that the fancy Midtown studios could never quite replicate. Young Paul Frehley wasn't supposed to be there that afternoon. He'd been hired as a temporary equipment assistant, a nobody kid who knew how to coil cables properly and keep his mouth shut, which were the only qualifications that mattered in the chaotic world of New York session work. His dreams of becoming a guitarist felt impossibly distant on days like this, when his job consisted mainly of carrying amplifiers up narrow staircases and making coffee runs for musicians whose names he'd never remember. But September 18th changed everything. The studio manager had told Paul to set up microphones for a session scheduled at 2 p.m., some jazz trio nobody had heard of. But when Paul arrived at noon to prep the room, he found the door already unlocked, and inside, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a Stratocaster resting across his lap, was Jimi Hendrix. Not the Hendrix of the posters and album covers, not the wild-eyed performer in paisley and velvet, but a quieter version, wearing a plain denim shirt and headband, his fingers moving across the fretboard in patterns that seemed to defy on the laws of music theory. Paul froze in the doorway, a box of microphone cables clutched against his chest, unable to move or speak or even breathe properly. Hendrix looked up, and instead of annoyance at the interruption, his face broke into that famous crooked smile. "You play?" he asked, nodding at the battered acoustic guitar case Paul had brought with him, the one he carried everywhere in case inspiration struck during lunch breaks. Paul managed to nod, still unable to form actual words. "Set that stuff down and grab your axe," Hendrix said, patting the floor beside him. "I'm working on something, and I need another set of ears. The cats I usually play with, they're too good, you know. Too trained. Sometimes you need someone who still hears music the way a kid hears it." What followed over the next 3 hours was a masterclass that no music school could have provided, a session that existed in some liminal space between jamming and teaching and pure exploration. Hendrix was working on a series of experimental pieces that would never see official release, songs that pushed against the boundaries of what rock guitar could do, incorporating elements of jazz fusion, Eastern scales, and effects processing that wouldn't become standard until decades later. He showed Paul techniques for coaxing feedback from amplifiers, for using the whammy bar to create sounds like crying or singing, for thinking of the guitar not as 6 separate strings, but as a single voice capable of speaking in tongues that hadn't been invented yet. But more than the technical lessons, what struck Paul most deeply was Hendrix's philosophy about music and fame and the price of success. Between takes, as they sat sharing a bottle of cheap wine that someone had left in the studio, Hendrix talked about the burden of expectation, about how the world wanted him to be a certain kind of performer, to always be on, to always deliver the pyrotechnics and the showmanship, when sometimes all he wanted was to sit in a quiet room and explore sounds that might never find an audience. "They want the experience," he said, referring to his band. "But they don't want to experience anything new. They want me to keep playing the same songs the same way forever. But music that doesn't evolve is already dead, you dig?" Paul understood, even then, even before he'd experienced any real success of his own. There was something in Hendrix's words that planted a seed, a warning about the trap that fame could become, about the danger of letting your public persona consume your private identity. Years later, when Paul Frehley became Ace Frehley and disappeared behind silver makeup and a space alien character, he would remember that afternoon and wonder if he'd heeded Hendrix's warning or fallen into the exact trap the master had described. As the session wound down and the scheduled jazz trio began arriving for their actual booked time, Hendrix gathered up several reel-to-reel tapes that had been stacked against the wall. These were the recordings they'd made that afternoon, along with what Hendrix said were several other experimental sessions from the past few weeks. He looked at them for a long moment, then looked at Paul. "Listen, man, I got a weird feeling about these," he said, his voice lower, more serious than it had been all afternoon. "I'm working on some things that the label cats aren't gonna understand. Too far out, too strange. But someday, maybe 10 or 20 years from now, people's ears will be ready for this stuff." He pulled out a thick black marker and wrote something on the top tape box, then handed the stack to Paul. "Keep these safe for me, yeah? Don't tell anyone you got them. Not the studio, not my manager, nobody. Just hold on to them. If something happens to me, if I'm not around anymore, these need to survive. They're gonna want to destroy anything that doesn't fit their image of who I'm supposed to be." The young Bronx kid wanted to refuse, wanted to say that Hendrix was being paranoid, that nothing was going to happen to one of the biggest rock stars in the world. But something in Hendrix's eyes, a strange certainty, made Paul simply nod and accept the responsibility. Only later, after he'd left the studio and was riding the subway back to the Bronx, did Paul look at what Hendrix had written on the tape box. In thick black marker, it said, "Ace, keep safe." At the time, Paul had no idea why Hendrix had chosen that particular word. The nickname wouldn't come until years later, given to him by fellow musicians who admired his technical skills. But somehow, in that studio on Bleecker Street, Jimi Hendrix had looked at an 18-year-old nobody and seen something, had known something, had chosen a name that would become iconic in ways that neither of them could have predicted. 10 months later, Jimi Hendrix was dead, found in a London apartment, choked on his own vomit after a night of pills and alcohol. He was 27 years old. The music world went into mourning, but the business side of the industry went into overdrive, racing to catalog and monetize every scrap of recorded material the guitarist had left behind. Paul Frehley, by then working day jobs and playing in basement bands, heard the news and looked at the stack of tapes he'd hidden in his bedroom closet. He knew he should probably turn them over to Hendrix's estate, but he remembered the urgency in Hendrix's voice, the specific instruction not to tell anyone. So the tapes stayed hidden, first in the Bronx apartment, then in a series of increasingly nicer homes as Paul Frehley transformed into Ace Frehley and Kiss climbed from club bands to arena headliners. Throughout the 70s, as Ace became one of the most recognizable figures in rock music, the Hendrix tapes remained his secret. There were moments when he almost revealed them, times when he was doing interviews about his influences, and Hendrix's name inevitably came up. But something always stopped him. Part of it was the promise he'd made, the sense that Hendrix had entrusted him with something important. Part of it was fear of the legal complications that would surely follow. But mostly it was a superstitious belief that those tapes represented something pure from before the fame and the makeup and the dysfunction, a connection to a simpler time when music was still just about the sound and not about the spectacle. The irony wasn't lost on Ace. Kiss had become the ultimate spectacle, a band where the music was almost secondary to the costumes and the fire-breathing and the blood-spitting and the elaborate stage shows. He'd become Space Ace, a character as much as a person, exactly the kind of public persona prison that Hendrix had warned against. During his darkest years, the late 70s and early 80s, when alcohol and substance abuse were slowly destroying him from the inside, Ace would sometimes pull out those tapes and just look at them, remembering the afternoon when one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived had treated a nobody kid like an equal, had shared his fears and his wisdom and his music. After leaving Kiss in 1982, after the rehab stays and the solo albums and the slow climb back to something resembling stability, Ace moved to a house in rural Connecticut, a place where he could escape the noise and chaos of the music industry. The Hendrix tapes came with him, stored in a fireproof safe along with other items he considered precious beyond monetary value, old photographs and letters, and the first guitar he'd ever owned. He'd been sober for several years by then, and in the quiet moments of his new life, he sometimes thought about what he should do with those recordings. Hendrix had been dead for over 3 decades. Surely the statute of limitations on his promise had expired. But every time he considered reaching out to the Hendrix estate or a music historian, something stopped him. Then came 2007, and everything changed in the most unexpected way possible. Ace had decided to downsize, to sell his Connecticut property and move somewhere smaller, somewhere with less upkeep and fewer memories. He hired an estate sale company to help him sort through decades of accumulated belongings, and over a weekend in early May, strangers picked through his garage and basement, purchasing items that ranged from old guitar pedals to furniture to boxes of miscellaneous junk that Ace himself had forgotten he owned. What Ace didn't realize until too late was that one of his assistants, a well-meaning but disorganized guy named Tommy, had accidentally included several boxes from the main house in the garage sale inventory. Among those boxes was a cardboard container marked simply Studio 1969 that contained the Hendrix tapes. By the time Ace realized the mistake, 3 days after the sale had ended, the tapes were gone, purchased by someone whose name the estate sale company didn't even have on record, since the buyer had paid in cash. Ace immediately tried to track them down, hiring a private investigator and even considering going public with the story, but ultimately decided against it. What would he say? That he'd been hiding unreleased Hendrix recordings for nearly 40 years? The legal implications alone were terrifying. So he said nothing and hoped that whoever bought them would never realize what they had, that the tapes would end up in another closet, forgotten for another few decades. But fate had other plans. 6 months after the garage sale, a middle-aged collector named Martin Bowles was sorting through items he'd purchased at various estate sales around Connecticut, looking for anything valuable enough to list on eBay. Among his acquisitions were the tapes from Ace's garage, and when Bowles saw the name Hendrix written on several of the reel boxes, his heart started racing. He spent the next week tracking down a working reel-to-reel player, and when he finally threaded the first tape and pressed play, what he heard made him realize he was holding something potentially worth millions of dollars. The recordings were unmistakably Jimi Hendrix, his distinctive guitar tone and playing style immediately recognizable even to a casual fan. But these weren't alternate takes of known songs or studio warm-ups. These were fully realized experimental pieces that sounded like nothing else in the Hendrix catalog, incorporating electronic effects and unusual time signatures and musical ideas that seemed decades ahead of their time. Bowles knew he was sitting on a potential fortune, but he also knew that claiming ownership of unreleased Hendrix material would require legal expertise far beyond his capabilities. This is where the story takes its strangest turn, where a simple garage sale discovery became a federal case. When Bowles contacted a lawyer to discuss his options for authenticating and potentially selling the tapes, the lawyer made the fateful decision to reach out to Experience Hendrix LLC, the company that manages Jimi Hendrix's estate. The company's initial response was skepticism. Unreleased Hendrix tapes turned up every few years, and the vast majority were either fakes or recordings of such poor quality that they had no commercial value. But when Bowles provided sample recordings, the company's tune changed immediately. Experience Hendrix confirmed that the recordings were genuine, but they also claimed that Bowles had no legal right to possess them. Since Hendrix had never officially released these recordings and had never transferred ownership to anyone before his death, the company argued that the tapes remained the property of the Hendrix estate, regardless of how many times they'd changed hands over the decades. Bowles refused to simply hand over what he considered his legal property, and the dispute escalated quickly. By early 2008, the FBI's art crime team had gotten involved, treating the tapes as stolen property that needed to be recovered and returned to their rightful owner. This is when investigators noticed something that transformed a straightforward intellectual property case into something far more mysterious. On the original tape box, beneath Hendrix's handwritten "Ace Keep Safe" notation, there were several other markings that appeared to be some kind of code or reference numbers. Additionally, analysis of the tape boxes themselves revealed fingerprints that didn't match either Hendrix or Bowles. The FBI brought in handwriting experts and audio forensics specialists, trying to determine not just the authenticity of the recordings, but the complete chain of custody going back to 1969. This is when they started asking questions that led them, eventually and inevitably, to Ace Frehley. Property records showed that Bowles had purchased items from Ace's estate sale. The word Ace on the tape box was obviously significant, and when FBI agents interviewed people who had worked in New York recording studios in the late 60s, a few remembered that Jimi Hendrix had occasionally used a young equipment assistant named Paul something, a kid from the Bronx who later became famous for something else entirely. When FBI agents showed up at Ace's California home in March 2008, he initially considered denying everything. But decades of sobriety had taught him that secrets only maintain their power in darkness, that the truth, however complicated, was usually preferable to lying. So he told them everything about the afternoon in 1969, about Hendrix's request to keep the tapes safe, about carrying that secret through decades of fame and dysfunction and recovery. He showed them his own memories from that period, photographs and documents that placed him in New York at the right time, working in the studios where Hendrix recorded. The FBI agents listened to Ace's story with expressions that shifted between skepticism and amazement. On one hand, the timeline checked out, and Ace's account explained details about the tapes that no one else could have known. On the other hand, it seemed almost too perfect, too much like a story constructed to explain away possession of stolen property. They asked him why he'd never come forward, why he'd hidden the tapes for so long. Ace's answer was simple and, to anyone who knew his history, entirely believable. "Jimi told me not to tell anyone," he said. "He trusted me with something important, and I kept that promise, even when keeping it probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. The legal wrangling that followed took nearly 2 years to resolve. The FBI ultimately concluded that Ace had not stolen the tapes and had not violated any laws by keeping them hidden, though his decision not to inform the Hendrix estate after Jimmy's death occupied a legal gray area that lawyers argued about at length. Experience Hendrix LLC agreed not to pursue charges against Ace in exchange for his cooperation in authenticating the recordings and providing historical context for their creation. Martin Bowles received a settlement for his role in bringing the tapes to light, though substantially less than the millions he'd initially hoped for. As for the recordings themselves, Experience Hendrix decided to release a carefully curated selection of tracks from the sessions in 2010 as part of a deluxe box set exploring Hendrix's experimental period. The album credits included a lengthy note about the tape's provenance, including Ace Frehley's role in preserving them, though the full story of that 1969 afternoon remained largely unknown to the public. Ace received no payment for his decades of safekeeping, but he did get something perhaps more valuable: official recognition from the Hendrix estate for his role in preserving an important piece of rock history. The recordings themselves justified all the decades of secrecy and legal drama. Music critics who heard the full sessions described them as revelatory, showing Hendrix pushing into territories that wouldn't be fully explored by other guitarists until the experimental rock movements of the 90s and 2000s. The influence of those sessions could be heard in Ace's own playing, in the way he approached guitar solos and sound effects during his Kiss years and beyond. That afternoon with Hendrix had planted seeds that took decades to fully bloom. Ideas about texture and tone that became part of Ace's signature sound. In interviews about the experience, Ace has remained philosophical about the whole strange saga. "I was just a kid who happened to be in the right place at the right time," he told one journalist. "Jimmy saw something in me before I saw it in myself, and he trusted me with something important. Yeah, maybe I should have handled it differently. Maybe I should have come forward sooner. But I kept my promise to him, and in the end, the music survived. That's what matters." The story of the lost Hendrix tapes and Ace Frehley's role in their preservation has become one of those legendary tales that circulates through rock history. A reminder that sometimes the most important moments happen off-stage and out of the spotlight, in quiet studios and chance encounters that ripple forward through decades. For Ace, it's a connection to a time before he became Space Ace, before the makeup and the fame and everything that came with it. A memory of an afternoon when he was just Paul from the Bronx, and Jimi Hendrix was just a guitarist chasing sounds that only he could hear. And for a few hours, they spoke the same language. The tapes that Hendrix marked with that prophetic word, Ace, are now preserved in climate-controlled archives, their contents available to scholars and fans, their place in rock history secure. But the real legacy of that September afternoon goes beyond the recordings themselves. It's about the trust between two musicians, about keeping promises even when doing so seems irrational, about the strange ways that fate connects lives across time and circumstance. Ace Frehley has played for millions of people, has created music that defined a generation, has survived the kinds of excess and chaos that destroyed lesser talents. But perhaps his most important contribution to rock and roll was simply being in a studio on Bleecker Street on a September afternoon in 1969, and being the kind of person that Jimi Hendrix knew he could trust with something precious. The Space Ace may have been a character, a creation for the stage, but the young man Hendrix met that day was real, and the connection they forged proved more enduring than either of them could have imagined.